All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are just getting started. I believe people are going to be trickling in, but we're going to go ahead. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really great to have you here. My name is Paul Thompson. I'm the Director of Conservation Programs at the Wildlife Conservation Network. And our goal today is to give you an inside peek into the Lion Recovery Fund. And share some of the highlights that our partners have achieved, all thanks to your support over the past several months, as well as take a look at what we have coming up in the next few months. This is the first time that we've done something like this, so we're really excited to try this new opportunity to connect with you, and we would really value your feedback. So at the end of the presentation, we are going to have a Q&A, and so you'll have a chance to have your questions answered. So please use the chat feature throughout Peter's presentation. Say whatever you want answered, and then at the end, we'll have a moderated discussion with him, and he can get to those. So also on that point, please say, as you pop in and join us here, please say where you're from in the chat. We'd love to hear. I'm calling in from San Francisco today, and Peter is going to be calling in from Zimbabwe, his hometown or home country. So the Lion Recovery Fund is part of WCN's portfolio of wildlife funds. We currently have 5 funds, ranging from an elephant crisis fund to, I'm proud to say, one of our newest funds, which is around pumas in California. And we can talk more a little bit about that later. But the Lion Recovery Fund is really a unique model for lion conservation. And some of the things that sets it apart from other lion projects is that it's a continent-wide effort. So this is not about one specific place or one specific strategy for protecting lions. We are really working at a continent-wide scale. We also support a wide swath of lion projects, ranging from individuals all the way up to larger organizations. And the LRF is really an efficient and effective organization or initiative. To date, since 2017, we've raised about $20 million, 100% of which has gone directly to the field. And of course, Peter is going to tell you a little bit more about the projects that those have gone to support. And that's going to be my transition over to the man at hand, Dr. Peter Lindsey, who, as I mentioned, is calling from Zimbabwe today, his home country. He's been working on African wildlife since about 1993. He's got such in-depth and impressive experience, not just on lions, but as well as other issues like predators from wild dogs to protected area management. And he's really been able to provide his high-level insights and perspectives to drive the Lion Recovery Fund to the success that we've achieved today. So please enjoy the presentation, stick around, add your questions into the chat, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. Without further ado, over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Now, if you could just tell me, folks, if my screen is coming through okay, the screen share. Just give me the thumbs up if it's working,
Yep.
Paul.
That works.
Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Just one minor correction on Paul's kind introduction. I'm actually in Malawi at the moment. I'm doing a site visit, which is an important part of my work, doing due diligence for LRF investments. But Zimbabwe is my home country, so I traveled here yesterday. Anyway, very happy to be here. I'm going to give you guys an update on progress with the Lion Recovery Fund. So to get started, so the thing with lions is that they're a very apparent species. So if you travel to Africa's best visited protected areas and reserves, lions tend to be fairly common. They're very apparent. They're very kind of in your face species. And so the fact that they've declined so severely caught many people, even in the conservation space, by surprise, because their commonness, their abundance in the well-protected parks and reserves belies the fact that they're disappearing and declining very severely elsewhere. They they currently occupy just 8% of their historic range. Their numbers have declined by almost 50% during the last 25 years. So a telling stat that we always like to share is that between the release of the first and the second Lion King movies, the lion numbers declined by about half. So it very much in most of the people on this call's lifetimes. And now we estimate there's somewhere between 20 and 25,000 lions. I think probably closer to 20 than 25,000. So they're not doing well. The reasons for this are diverse. There's a number of threats that cause direct mortality of lions themselves. So examples include retaliatory killing of lions in response to livestock depredation, as in this rather gruesome photo here. Cultural or ritual killing of lions, the bycatch of lions in snares, which is a really big one. And increasingly, we're seeing targeted poaching of lions for their body parts. Another suite of threats, and again, excuse the grim photo, I promise I'm not going to bombard you with grim photos, is the bushmeat trade and poaching of wildlife for meat. This is, if I was to pick a single threat that faces lions, the single greatest threat, and indeed most other wildlife species in Africa, I would say it was this one. The abundance of lions tends to be very tightly correlated to the abundance of prey. So when prey populations decline, lion populations also tend to decline quickly. And then we see habitat destruction, also threats that affect lions' habitats. And as Africa's human population grows, there's increasing demand for space for settlement, for agriculture. There's increasing pressure on woodlands and forests for charcoal and timber, etc. And so we're seeing increasing swaths of the continent being deforested like this at pace. So in response to this rather worrying backdrop, the Lion Recovery Fund was initiated 4 years ago. I can't believe that it's already been 4 years. It's been a real roller coaster ride. And the first thing that we did when we established the fund was to establish a science-based strategy to guide our investments. This was really important, so we didn't spend time second guessing and flip-flopping from one kind of philosophy to the next. We consulted widely within the conservation community, the lion conservation community, but also much more widely than that. And we came up with a strategy whereby our investments are designed to protect lions, protect their prey, and protect their habitats in line with the principal threats facing the species. And it's been a roller coaster 4 years. So this is a map of the grants that we've issued. So you can see that we've hit our straps, we've hit the ground running. So far, there's been 167 grants issued in support of 63 different organizations, and we've granted out just over $20 million. So this has made the LRF comfortably the most significant lion-specific funder. But I think it's really important to note that the LRF has also emerged as a very significant funder of landscape conservation, so protected area management, for community conservation initiatives, and also for illegal wildlife trade type projects. So it's not just about lions. That's a theme that I'll come back to. A number of themes to LRF granting have emerged over the 4 years, and you know, there are quite a number of them, but in this talk I'll present 3 or 4 of them just for your interest. And one of them that I'm perhaps most passionate about, and that we put the most effort into is growing the conservation footprint. So we've got some research coming out this month that shows that the effective management of Africa's conservation areas is limited to about 10% of the conservation areas sampled, and that was a big sample. So this means that about 80% of conservation areas are in a state of failure or decline. And if we can't expand the effective conservation footprint, the area that's under effective management, we are simply going to lose these areas in the context of growing human populations. And this is really significant from a biodiversity perspective, but also from a climate change perspective, because that would cause massive habitat loss and carbon release. Again, I'll come back to that. But this kind of scene where you have underfunded protected areas and rangers not able to do their job properly is a unnervingly common one. So there's lots of examples of where the LRF has invested in trying to expand the footprint of effective management and help neglected conservation landscapes. So a good example of this is in Eastern Central African Republic. I may have spoken to some of you guys before about this, and I speak about it often because I think it's the site in Africa with the greatest recovery potential for lions. I think it's the wildest part of Africa. There's a massive, massive wilderness area in Eastern Central African Republic with very few people. And African Parks, who are one of Africa's most effective conservation NGOs, have got a mandate over an area of about 55,000 square kilometers, which is, to put that in context, that's about 6 or 7 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. So it's a gigantic area. They don't have funding yet to cover that whole area, but with LRF support, they were able to expand the area of operations by about 3,000 square kilometers. I should have that in square miles, but my brain just doesn't work like that. But it's a big area, suffice to say. And through African Parks' efforts, they're starting to see notable recoveries in prey populations and lion populations in that area. And I think this is a really exciting view into what might come in future. And this is a hyper biodiverse area because it contains both forest and savanna wildlife. So it's really, really special. Another example is in Southeast Angola. There's one of Africa's largest protected area complexes down there. It's relatively recently gazetted. It's an area of almost 10 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. So we're talking really gigantic, but it's effectively unmanaged. And so we've been supporting Panthera to introduce a management presence in the southeastern corner of that protected area, which is a key part of the Kaza Transfrontier Conservation Area. So that's the Kavango, Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. And Panthera are already seeing, just by introducing basic management and anti-poaching, a significant reduction of poaching in the area in which they operate, and early signs of a recovery in both lion and other species numbers, which is really encouraging. Long way to go, but early encouraging signs. Another good example is in the long neglected protected area complex in northern Zambia on Lake Tanganyika. And this is an incredibly beautiful area, but it was badly neglected for many, many years, to the point where in the early 2000s, lions all but disappeared. There might be the odd roaming male lion around there, if any, probably none remaining. But LRF was an early funder to support Frankfurt Zoological Society to introduce conservation management into this area, first by introducing basic anti-poaching and getting the steering under control, and then helping to reintroduce prey animals as a prelude to reintroducing lions in maybe 2 or 3 years' time. So excitingly, 2 or 3 months ago, they started reintroducing species that were in low numbers, like zebra and buffaloes, that are of key importance for lions, to augment the already growing populations of puku, sable, roan, reedbuck, sitatunga, etc. Short video. I know. Oh, Jerry. And for me, it's just so exciting to see that kind of ecological rehabilitation in action. There's already enough prey there, we think, to support lions, but we're just going to give it, I say we, Frankfurt Zoological Society and the Zambian authorities, another 2 or 3 years, just to allow those prey populations to grow further before adding the pressure of having lion populations there. But it's really exciting. Another site in which we're trying to grow the conservation footprint is one that many of you will be familiar with because of the amazing work of Colleen Begg, who is a prominent figure in the governance structure of the LRF. So we've supported, so Niassa Special Reserve is actually the site where we've invested the most funding. It's a massive, massive protected area in northern Mozambique. And we have supported Colleen Begg to support other conservation actors in the ecosystem to basically expand her excellent model of effective protected area management and community engagement across a higher proportion of the area. And this investment is not so much about lion recovery as retaining a big population of lions that already occurs there. It could recover somewhat, but at a lot of lions, we need to make sure they don't decline. Another exciting example I'm going to mention to you is the Zambezi Delta of Mozambique. So I had the privilege of visiting this area earlier this year, and it is an absolute Eden. So, a lot of you would never even have heard of it. It's, as the name suggests, it's where the Zambezi River enters the sea in Mozambique, and there's a vast wetland floodplain that surrounds it, and it just has an absolute abundance of wildlife. It's incredible. Check this video. So it's an area that has very, very high abundance of prey animals for lions. For example, there are well over 20,000 buffalo that are increasing by about 1,000 animals a year. There are thousands of whoa, my screen froze. Thousands of other species like zebra, wildebeests, reedbuck, sable, eland, bush pigs. It's really, really abundant. It's quite a big area. It's 11,000 square kilometers, which is 1.5 times the size of Yellowstone. But it's very, very rich. And so far, an increasing proportion of it is coming under effective management, but there are still big blocks that are subject to significant poaching. And so LRF has just literally this month signed off on a grant to help expand the conservation footprint there. And it's really exciting because it has a rapidly recovering lion population, something I'll come back to. So this is a photograph of a lion reintroduction that happened there in 2018. And as I'll come back to later, the numbers are doing really well. And with our support, we're hoping we can allow this recovery to go even further than it otherwise would. Super exciting. It's a beautiful place. If any of you guys could ever get there one day, do so. Theme of kickstarting new conservation initiatives. So often there's this kind of chicken and egg situation where there's a need for new conservation initiatives, but conservation funders won't back them until they have experience or proof of concept. The LRF is not like this. If we see a good conservation actor with a good idea, we'll back them, and then in the knowledge that other funders will come on board. And in fact, LRF funding has been remarkably effective at leveraging other funding. We've invested $20 million, and so far our grantees have leveraged an additional $6 million that we know of as a result of the prestige associated with LRF granting. A very good example of kickstarting a new conservation initiative is the emerging conservation NGO called Conserve. Watch this space. So we convened a meeting in 2018 to discuss the growing issue of what to do with Africa's concession areas, hunting blocks, forestry areas, and areas that are really, really neglected, especially as the hunting industry is beginning to contract. We're seeing more and more vacant concessions, and as concessions become vacant, they become more and more subject to human pressures. And so in response to this, the best idea that we came up with at that meeting was to form a conservation NGO that bid for concessions and then brought them under conservation management. And Andrew Parker, the former second in charge of African Parks, did just this and launched Conserve. And here's a very short video by Andrew explaining the concept.
Conserve is 1.5 years old, and we are standing here now in Tondwa Game Management Area, which is Conserve's first project, which we are doing in conjunction with the Frankfurt Zoological Society. What an incredible landscape. We've just done a flight over the landscape and honestly exceeded all expectations. 2/3 of Africa's protected area estate falls outside of national parks, yet hardly any effort is being applied to secure these vast and wonderful landscapes. The need and opportunity for the establishment of Conserve was born out of a meeting catalyzed by the Lion Recovery Fund in 2018. And from that time, we have worked together with Peter Lindsey and his team at LRF to conceive what is needed, what is required to secure these landscapes with pressures in Africa growing exponentially. And since that time, Conserve has grown, has been established with a single-minded focus, investing time, effort, money in securing these threatened but highly, highly valuable landscapes outside of national parks. And none of this would have been possible without the support of the Lion Recovery Fund, not only financially, but also in terms of the conception of the idea, the recognition of the urgency, the need for intervention, and just the ongoing belief that this is an absolutely critical intervention and that Conserve is the right organization to do the job.
So watch this space, guys. I think you're going to hear a lot more about Conserve in future. I think they're going to make a very, very big difference. And we're proud to have invested over $1 million in helping to kickstart the organization. Such is the extent of our belief in what they're trying to do. Another really good example of helping to kickstart a new conservation initiative are the significant grants we've given to the Mozambique Wildlife Alliance. So the MWA are playing a critical role in terms of partnering with the Mozambican wildlife authorities and NAC, who are severely underfunded and undercapacitated to deliver key conservation services. So they do things like help tackle illegal wildlife trade, they help to tackle human-lion conflict, human-wildlife conflict, and they provide veterinary interventions, such as, for example, wildlife translocations. And in this example, you see João Almeida, the founder of MWA, darting a lion that was in an area where it was bound to be killed by local villagers to move it to an area of safety. So, I mean, we've just been so impressed at the number of animals that MWA have treated, have translocated, have dealt with it. It's just been absolutely fantastic. They've collared a lot of lions. So this is the lion that was darted there and it was moved to safety. It's thriving. Another example is in this slide where I decided to take the grim slide out, but there was this lion had the misfortune of being caught in a horrible gin trap or bear trap, I think Americans call them, like a snap trap, that basically took its entire paw off except for the one claw you could see there. MWA darted the animal, removed the trap, treated the wound, re-released the lion out, and this lion is thriving, alive and well in spite of kind of missing a paw. So these guys are doing fantastic work. And we were really proud to have been an early investor and significant investor in their organization. So another theme of LRF granting is using lions as a flagship species. So I'll go on about this until the cows come home. So we're passionate about lions, but the LRF is about much more than lions. It's about the landscapes and all of the biodiversity that occurs in those landscapes. So for example, our investments support a whole swath of savanna biodiversity, and perhaps there's no other species that symbolizes this more than the African wild dog or painted dog. LRF is investing in 33% of wild dog range, and this includes some of the most troubled parts of the species range, such as Central African Republic, South Sudan, Senegal, Angola, where there are no wild dog conservation projects to be seen. LRF funding is supporting the conservation of these animals through basic area management and anti-poaching. It's really important. Our funding is helping to protect many of Africa's iconic landscapes. And this is really important, not just from a biodiversity perspective, but I come back from a carbon perspective. Africa's protected area network is truly vast, but it's very underfunded. And as I said, because of the rapid human population growth, if we can't areas, they will become deforested, and this will cause massive carbon release. And I truly believe the world is asleep at the wheel on this issue. Everyone seems to be focusing on clean energy and tree planting in the developed world and things like that. Yes, they're important. But what is critically important as well is protecting natural habitat in Africa in particular, because that's the continent that's going to come under the greatest pressure in the coming decades due to human population growth. If we forget about that, I promise you we're going to see massive quantities of carbon released. So the LRF is working hard to protect these landscapes. And in addition, these landscapes also help to protect key ecosystem services, such as the provision of fresh water, the protection of watersheds and water towers. And a key example of this is in Kafue, where the vast Kafue ecosystem is a massively important provider of water for Lusaka and other key urban areas in Zambia. So it's not just about lions, it's not even just about biodiversity, it's not even just about carbon. It's about all of the ecosystem services and the economies that rely on natural areas and the people that live in and among them. Another key theme has been keeping essential conservation services running through the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected conservation in Africa in two key ways. So firstly, it's reduced funding, principally by the near collapse of the tourism industry, but also by increasing some threats that African wildlife is facing, especially increased levels of bushmeat poaching due to increased joblessness and poverty and food insecurity. And so we've been investing in emergency grants to make sure that rangers stay on the ground. And a very good example of this is our investments in the iconic Serengeti National Park, where we've supported the Frankfurt Zoological Society and Tanapa, Tanzania National Park Authority de-snaring teams. These teams have removed literally tens of thousands of snares over the last 3 years. And we learned that without LRF emergency grant funding, these teams would have ceased to operate during 2020 and 2021. So your funding really is making a big difference, I promise you that. Another very cool example of a COVID emergency grant was to Conservation South Luangwa in Zambia. So a big issue has been that lots of tourism staff have been furloughed, which causes massive ripple effects, negative effects to the livelihoods of families in many of the areas in and around protected areas. So what Conservation South Luangwa have done is that they're using LRF funding, is that they've hired a bunch of furloughed tourism guides to provide conservation services. And in this slide, you see them giving game drives to community members. So it's so cool because community members normally only see wildlife in the context of human-wildlife conflict, when elephants are raiding their fields and lions are killing their livestock, etc. They never get to see wildlife as tourists get to see, and as a result, they often don't have the same kind of sense of affinity for it. And so this has been a hugely successful program in terms of helping to build support for and a local constituency for conservation, and the communities have absolutely loved it, as of course of the guides, because they've been continuing to have paid work. They've also been paid. These are a bunch of tourism guides doing de-snaring patrols, and this has resulted in the employment of many guides who've removed hundreds and hundreds of snares. Another theme has been nurturing the next generation of conservation leaders. We're a big believer at the LRF that for the resonance of conservation efforts and messaging to be increased for governments and local communities, we absolutely need to increase the proportion of conservation efforts that are led by indigenous Africans. And so we've been supporting a number of emerging conservationists, such as, for example, the inspiring More Angels in Biza, Dr. More Angels in Biza, who's the lady in the white shirt here, who's starting her own conservation project in Zimbabwe. Jonathan Kuyega, the chap in the white shirt at the back, who's got an amazing grassroots conservation organization in southern Tanzania, and who works with these Sakuma communities that live around the protected areas to try and stop them from killing lions in cultural lion killing, and also to promote coexistence between wildlife and local people. He's doing amazing work. Louis Nkuluka is another example. So Louis is someone many of you may have met. She came to Expo a couple of years ago. She's leading an inspiring campaign to reduce demand for illegal bushmeat in Zambia. And then another example is Deo Tarimo, who's an inspiring young Tanzanian guy who's just starting his lion conservation project in Mkomazi National Park. And it's amazing how keen he was. You know, he was borrowing money from his father. He was using his dad's car to do lion work in Mkomazi. He had very little support. And thankfully, we've been able to back him. And we've also matched one of our other LRF grantees with him to act as mentors for him. And so we really think we're going to give him a significant step up in his desire to become a fully fledged lion conservationist, which is really exciting. So coming to the close of my presentation, make no mistake, the path ahead is tough for Africa's lions. I see it as staring down a bottleneck. Africa's human populations are growing. They're expected to double by 2050 and possibly even quadruple by the end of the century. So there's going to be less space for wildlife. The threats are going to be more intense. The continent's still grappling with governance and corruption issues, and there's still a severe shortage of funding. But I'm a firm believer that there's light at the end of that tunnel. If our generation and the 2 or 3 or 4 generations that follow us can step up to the plate and shepherd enough of Africa's wild places and wildlife and lions through this bottleneck, I believe that once we get through that phase, the wildlife that remains will remain in perpetuity. By then, there'll be more funding, there'll be stronger support for conservation, the governance will be better, human populations will stabilize and even decline. But we've got this tough period ahead. It's not all bad. There are some bright spots. I mean, there are at least 10 sites within our portfolio where lion populations are increasing. but we've got to be realistic. Times ahead are tough. That said, there are key reasons for optimism, and we mustn't forget that. Lions are prolific breeders. If you protect them, their prey, and their habitats, they can breed really quickly. And coming back to that example of the Zambezi Delta, the 24 lions that were reintroduced in 2018 now number over 70 individuals. So they're really increasing very quickly, and that just demonstrates what can be done. Africa has a massive protected area estate. We believe if it was we estimate if it was managed optimally, it could support between 3 and 4 times the number of lions that currently exist. And the continent has really strong political will, for which I think it deserves a lot of commendament. And there is a growing local constituency for conservation. We have the tools and interventions that we know work. We just need to raise the funding to deepen them and scale them up. So I just want to say a big thank you to every single one of you that have provided support to the Lion Recovery Fund. I promise you that 100% of those funds go to the field, and I make it my job day and night to ensure that our funds are invested as wisely and efficiently as possible. So with your support, we hope we can bring lions roaring back. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Over to you, Paul.
All right. Thank you very much, Pete. And yeah, thank you for everybody for joining us right now. So please do, if you have additional questions or things you'd like Pete to address, please drop those in the chat. I did see one earlier from Linda, Pete, that she was asking about the human population challenge facing Africa and sort of what are the impacts on that and how are folks addressing that?
Yeah, very good question. So the first thing I would say is that it's very difficult to influence demographic trends. So even for governments, you see in the West, for example, the birth rates are starting to dip below replacement rate, and it's very difficult for governments to change these trends when they start. That said, the most important thing that we could do in Africa to bring the birth rate down is to empower women, educate women and girls. And so it's difficult for conservation projects to do that on a local scale, but I think making every effort to empower and engage women and provide educational opportunities, I think, is the best thing that we can possibly do.
Okay, great. We have a question from Maynard that's regarding the average cost of a lion collar.
Oh, it really depends on the type. I mean, it's frustrating that the tech of for lion collars and wildlife collars in general is so archaic and expensive, but they're, depending on the type, they're kind of anywhere from $500 to $3,500. So they're expensive, frustratingly expensive. Conservation isn't cheap.
So Lisa had a great observation. She noticed that we don't have any LRF projects in South Africa. So can you talk a little bit about what's happening in South Africa and our approach there?
We do actually have a projects in South Africa. That map just needs updating. So we've got a project that straddles Kruger and Limpopo National Park, where the Kruger part of that project is to start monitoring and counting the lion populations, because we are starting to worry that there's a bit of an issue with lion poaching in Kruger for body parts. And so the first step is to get a better handle on what's going on with the lions. In addition, there's the African Lion Database is based in South Africa, in Johannesburg, run by Endangered Wildlife Trust that we support. In general, South Africa is much better funded than other parts of the continent, and the bigger issue in most of South Africa is overpopulation of lions in the small reserves rather than declines in lion populations. But as I said, I think that we've possibly been a bit guilty of taking Kruger in particular for granted. And we, as I said, we've started investing there, and I think we're going to have a closer look at South Africa going forward. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. We haven't forgotten about South Africa. It's very much on the radar. It's an important country for lions.
Great. Well, so I guess, kind of while we're speaking geographically, tell us a little bit more about the status of lions in West and Central Africa. and sort of how are efforts out there different compared to a lot of the projects that we've been supporting in the more classic savanna ecosystems that people think of when we think of lions in East and Southern Africa?
Yeah, good question. So the West African lion subspecies is critically endangered. There are just a few hundred of them remaining. Conservation efforts in West and Central Africa are much more embattled than they are elsewhere in the continent. It's for a number of reasons. So population pressures are higher. Maybe the culture of conservation is not as strong in those countries as was bestowed somehow on the Southern Eastern African countries, although I might get pilloried for saying that. A lot of the West and Central African countries along the Sahel are suffering from political instability and conflict, which doesn't help. And so there's a variety of reasons why lions are struggling in those areas, but there are some signs of success. We're seeing an increasing number of public-private partnerships between organizations like African Parks and WCS and the local wildlife authorities. And so there are some success stories. For example, the lions in Senegal, that we're supporting a Panthera project in Niokolo-Korba National Park, and the lions are showing early signs of recovery. African Parks have brought poaching under control in Penjari and Park W in Benin. In Zakuma National Park, African Parks have brought poaching under control and lion populations are increasing. And in Chinko, we're seeing lion populations increasing there. So it's not all bad by any stretch, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot.
You mentioned PPPs. Can you, for those who might not be familiar with public-private partnerships, can you give a quick little overview on what those are?
Yeah, actually the correct term is collaborative management partnerships between an NGO and a wildlife authority, where the wildlife authority forms an official partnership with the NGO, and then there are different types. So the African Parks model is one where essentially the wildlife authority delegates authority to the NGO for managing the area. And then you have joint co-management variety where it's a shared effort. And then you have financial and technical support partnerships where an NGO just supports the wildlife authority to fulfill its mandate. So this is an increasingly important conservation tool. And if I was to pick one, I would say it's a single most simple conservation tool at our disposal in Africa at the moment.
So considering that it seems to be such an effective tool, do you think that that type of partnership and model for conservation is on the rise, increasing throughout Africa?
Yeah, no, it is unambiguously. So 75% of these partnerships have arisen since 2015. So there's a very rapid growth. And I think part of the reason for that is that African Parks in many senses trailblazed and showed how effective it could be. African governments are starting to feel more comfortable. In the beginning, I think they felt like it was a bit of an affront, or they were worried about loss of sovereignty or private armies or these kind of concerns. But as they realize that the agreements are such that they don't lose any sovereignty, that they ultimately still retain full control, it's starting to become a much more mainstream and accepted conservation intervention. And we're really excited about it because it's got huge potential.
Great. I want to take a question from the chat. This one's from Ivan. He says, how can the LRF raise even more money by promoting some of the co-benefits that you mentioned in your presentation, right? Deforestation, landscape level issues, climate change, ecosystem services, stuff like that. Do you think that that's an opportunity for LRF to leverage those issues to raise more money to then funnel back into those landscapes for lions?
Yeah, I do. I really do. I think that we maybe haven't been good enough yet, if I was to be honest, at quantifying and selling this message, because it's genuine and it's real, the impact the fund is having on these issues. So absolutely right, Ivan, I think we could do a lot better at packaging that messaging. And one thing I would also say is just put the request out there. I think one thing that really helps with fundraising is if donors speak to other donors and foundations speak to other foundations and help us with the networking process of bringing other donors on board. And if you're able and willing to do that for us, we'd be hugely grateful. Just throwing it out there.
So you mentioned that the LRF is the biggest funding mechanism for lions to date. So tell us, what does that mean in terms of the influence the LRF has on across the lion community? What's enabled it what has it enabled us to do?
Yeah, so it has enabled us to play a unique role in terms of convening actors because we have a very tight mandate, a very tight mission. So we don't do conservation work ourselves. We fund it. So we're not a player in the field. So we can bring conservation players together as a convener and convene on key issues. So an example was a crisis meeting on what to do with all of these concession areas. And then another example is we're bringing people together. We brought people together at the meeting that was held at Disney, one of our very strong supporters, on how to brainstorm how to grow the conservation footprint, which was also really important in terms of kickstarting collaborations. And we're also convening on conservation actors on survey methods for lions and their prey, because this is something that lion conservationists tend to bicker about a lot. And we want to bring them together and try and get people on the same page and use more standardized methods and get people working together and collaborating more. So that's a role that we can play for sure.
Cool. So here's a question from Lucinda that's kind of building on our previous question around funding. Do you think that the COP26 Glasgow Climate Summit will bring more funding for this area, meaning maybe lion conservation? And kind of stemming from that, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the ways that we're taking climate change into account in terms of our approach for conservation.
Yeah, I mean, it might. So the big hope for conservation in Africa is really that global concern around climate is going to start translating into real funding for conservation efforts on the ground. So we're hopeful that it will translate to conservation for the management of these areas. We sincerely hope so. A cool example of how we're kind of engaging in the climate change space has been through our partnership with an organization called Biocarbon Partners. Lucinda, I think you and I chatted about this the other day when we met. Biocarbon Partners are protecting vast swaths of forest and woodland in Zambia. They're selling carbon credits. They're investing the proceeds from that in, well, communities get a big chunk, and they're also investing a portion in the management of these areas. And what they're trying to do is sell the carbon credits as a premium and by marketing them as carbon, because it's not just carbon, it's lions and it's all of the biodiversity. So their argument is kind of the inverse of ours. So we're saying that our lions come with carbon, and they're saying that their carbon comes with lions. So we've backed them to help them get through the difficult period when they start, up until the point where they're selling their first carbon credits. And we supported them through that tricky period, and now they're up and running and they're selling credits, and it's happening. So it's super exciting.
Cool. So a question from Bruce. It opens up an interesting topic. So he said that he had the opportunity to visit one of the Walk with Lions tourist attractions near Victoria Falls. And after the initial fun, he realized with horror that they were producing a large quantity of lions that had been socialized and habituated to humans. Do you have any thoughts on that issue of that type of lion tourism, where it's well, I'll leave it for you.
Yeah, I don't like it. There's, that kind of tourism was, in my opinion, falsely predicated on the fact that the lions were being bred for reintroduction. And the fact is that we just don't need captive lions for reintroduction, because we have wild lions that we can reintroduce. And there are lots of issues associated with captive lions, not least their familiarity with people. Also, we don't know their genetic stock. And so it's a false fallacious argument. And so I think it's somewhat exploitative of the lions. And so not a big fan of it, really. So I would generally steer clear from that kind of tourism personally. I think just generally tourism that involves captive animals, with the exception of accredited zoos, I think need to be really avoided. Try and stick with wild animals in a wild context as much as possible.
Now you're joining us today from Malawi. And you said that part of your time in Malawi is to visit some projects and do some project vetting. Can you tell us a little bit about how you go about vetting potential projects for funding through the LRF? Sort of what kind of criteria you use that counts as an effective lion project?
Yeah, absolutely. So key elements are, we look at does the project idea fit the strategy of the LRF? That's a key one. Is the NGO in question, because we always support NGOs that have partnerships with government. Is the NGO credible? So that means going to look at the work that they do in the field as much as possible. So I spend a lot of my time, maybe half, 40% maybe of my time bombing around Africa in the field, visiting projects. Are they doing good work? Speaking to other actors in the conservation sphere and doing triangulation. Do they have a clear mandate from the government? And critically, is there real value addition? So will the funding that we give them, make a major and quantitative difference to the impact that they're already having? And will they be able to measure the impact that they're having? Do they have a solid monitoring and evaluation protocol in place, et cetera, et cetera? So these are some of the factors that we look at when we do due diligence.
And how much time do you spend bombing around Africa in the field?
About 40%. I wish it was more because I love it. It's a very fortunate thing to have to do, but it's a lot of fun. It's tiring, but it's fun, and it's a real privilege. But it's important because I'd like to say I don't think that many other funders go to that extent of effort to do due diligence in the field. So I think it's something that we do pride ourselves on with this model.
Great. So maybe take a moment to tell us what, in all your travels and in all of the impressive number of projects that the LRF has supported, what would you say is one that you felt was kind of one of the biggest risks that we took, with some of the most surprising outcomes?
Oh, gosh, there's a big question. Biggest risks that we took. Well, that's a really tricky one, because we take risks in the sense that we back conservation organizations and that there's a possibility that they'll fail. But a good example of that, I wouldn't say it was that risky, but we were an early backer of a very cool conservation project in Kafue National Park called Musikesi Conservation. And so I don't think it was a huge risk because I was a believer in what they had in mind and the people involved. But I think I was surprised at how quickly they gained traction and just how much impact they had. So they went from a situation where there was really bad bushmeat poaching, where there was a lot of lions being snared and trapped in their area of influence, to a situation now where there's virtually none. There's virtually no lions being snared. And where wildlife populations are starting to increase. So I think that's a good example. Yeah. I'm
surprised you didn't say conserve.
Well, I don't really see it as a risk, because the actors involved are absolutely top class individuals, like consummate professionals, and the mission that they're setting out on is so utterly vital that I have no doubt that they will succeed. So we were the first major backer of Conserve. We've given them over $1 million, and they've already raised another $3.5 million, which is peanuts compared to what they need for the job they have at hand. But they're already gaining real traction. They've done major due diligence, and they're just in the process of signing their first concession. So I don't see any real risk in that, but I think of all the investments we have made, I think that one will result, when I retire in whenever that'll be, looking back, I think that might be the one where we look back and think that it had the largest impact.
Great. So maybe take a minute to tell us how the LRF actually works, sort of what kind of governance structures do we have, and how do we go about executing on getting all this money out to the projects that need it most?
Yeah, good question. So we have a leadership team that's comprised of internal WCN people that provide guidance on the day-to-day functioning of the fund, and when I as the director need advice, or if we're changing anything that we do with the fund, that's a sounding board, And if we need to make any major changes in the way it operates, the leadership team make a collective decision. But the most important part of the governance structure is the grants committee. So we have a granting committee that's comprised of, it's got one internal representative, namely Paul, and then Colleen Begg is a long-term representative. You know, Colleen is a stalwart of the LRF. She's so respected within the community that she adds an enormous amount of gravitas, and she just has this incredible knowledge and this common sense. So she's a fantastic member of the grants committee. And then we have a number of other conservationists, sort of high profile conservationists, experience with different thematic and geographic experience. And so the way it works is I'm mandated to go and find projects to solicit proposals from. That's my job. And then the proposals go to the grants committee, and then that's the end of my influence. So I can explain to the committee why I think we should fund this, but it's the committee that actually make the decisions on whether it will be funded or not. And so sometimes we have some interesting conversations where I'm really trying to get the committee to fund a project, and they're tearing it apart at the seams and really really going through the proposal with a fine-tooth comb. So it's a really good system. And then we also have a network of technical advisors from the wider conservation sphere that I will phone up whenever I need to ask for advice on various issues. So that's the governance.
Cool. Pete, tell us how people in the audience can help. Sort of how can their donation be maximized here? And if somebody was to make a donation of $100 or $1,000, kind of what would that do for the LRF?
Yeah, it would really make a difference. It would, as I said, 100% of those funds go to the field, and the donations, no matter how big or how small, that do two things. So firstly, they really help to reduce the amplitude of fluctuations in funding that we might get. So the cumulative impact of small donations can be really significant. And also, as I said, we've got a leveraging ratio of over 1. So for every dollar that we're investing, conservation groups are leveraging more than $1 on average. So if you give $100, it will more than likely result in more than $200 being heading out to the field. And the average salary for a ranger in Africa is probably $350 a month. And so, $100 is like a week of ranger time, kind of, for example. So it can really have a big impact in terms of how to help. Obviously, financial support is big. And as I said, spreading the word, particularly among your peers and among other donors and other foundations, I think could really have a profound impact. And we'd really appreciate that kind of networking if you're willing.
Great. Okay, here's my last question before we wrap. And it's, what can people expect if they join us at the WCN Expo in October?
Yeah, so the WCN Expo is going to be amazing. It's going to showcase a whole bunch of different conservationists, the WCN partner organizations, and all of the WCN funds. And we're also going to have another presentation from the LRF that's going to showcase some other projects and provide some unique insights, because it's such a behemoth, it's such a big thing now, the fund. So I think it's well worth attending. There's going to be some amazing conservationists there. We'd love to see you. It's the big calendar event of the year for WCN, and it's a massive amount of work, but it's an incredible amount of fun as well. So please join us.
Definitely, yeah. Pete is going to be hosting another in-depth talk for the Lion Recovery Fund as part of our WCN Expo in October on the 9th, Saturday. And that is going to be virtual. You can find out all the details, if you're not already familiar, on the WCN Expo website, which is wcnexpo.org. We've got some really great talks lined up this year, so please join us there. Now, that's all the time we have for today. So really, thanks again for tuning in. We really appreciate your time and your support. We absolutely couldn't have made the success of the LRF possible without you. So thank you for your support, and keep showing up, keep yourselves healthy, and have a very wonderful day. And Pete, go enjoy a beer. It's probably that time in Malawi. So thanks again for joining us today as well, Pete.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.